loved in this world, as well as the memories of all the good times we shared growing up. I'm slowly making my way across the country, hopeful that I can make it back to the town that time forgot before the police catch up with me. I swear my sister was not a monster, but I also know I didn't kill anybody. Unfortunately, I can't prove either of those facts to anyone, or that Lainey was even real until I truly understand what's going on myself. I'm terrified at even the thought of going back up that mountain, but I think it's the only choice I have left. I have to find answers as to what made her do those horrific things, as well as why nobody remembers her but me. Well, remembers her to be alive anyway. I don't know if those things in the woods changed reality in some way, or maybe even sent me somewhere else, but I know they did this. I know all this insanity is connected to them, whatever the hell they are. I'll try to pick up some sort of weapon before I get back to that mountain, and I'll get the truth to all of it, even if I have to gut a few of those creatures in the process. I'll set this right. I'll make everyone see it one way or another. It took me a few days to make that cross-country trip back to the broken-down old city, as I only traveled at night. I dyed my hair, muddied up my license plate, and even painted my camper a little bit to try and evade detection. I could only keep my fingers crossed that my meager attempt at a makeshift camouflage color scheme would be enough to not warrant any second glances from any police cars I may have inadvertently passed by. It wasn't pretty, but it did help a little when nesting the old girl behind whatever trees I found to hide out before sunrise. Even though I'd spent a good deal of my life since moving out of my mother's house on my own, I still felt almost cripplingly lonesome, especially on those long days hiding in my camper. I would take some chances here and there, walking to local fast food joints and various stores for food and the like. But I always kept my head down and spoke as little as possible. Most of my gas stops were at night, and I would only use cash for my transactions. I pulled every cent I had out of the bank before giving the authorities a chance to lock me out, so I was sure I had enough to cover whatever I may need. Since Lainey had done the majority of the navigating from the passenger seat, I wasn't entirely certain I was going the right direction when I neared the border of the state that housed the ghost town. I ended up backtracking quite a few times, basically getting myself more lost. I didn't recognize anything the closer I got. I was sure I was at least in the neighborhood, but I'd gotten so turned around I had to find a new hiding spot for the day before I'd be able to continue after nightfall. I was yelling and cursing while I searched for a good place to park, feeling my face burn from the frustration of being so close yet so far. When I finally found the day's resting area, I cut the engine off and just sat there, feeling as though my ears were billowing thick plumes of smoke, while fighting against the urge to beat the hell out of my steering wheel. I stared through the windshield, focusing on calming my breathing while gazing upon yet another series of trees beyond the glass. I was growing incredibly tired of this whole ordeal, but I had little choice but to plunder on, and just hope to God I could find a way to fix the train wreck my life had become.
You're not far off now, Bri.
Lainey said from the passenger seat. Shit, I can't tell. I feel like I've been driving in circles for the last few hours. Somehow, I had felt her with me this whole time, and somewhere in my chaotic mind, I knew she couldn't be, but I didn't question it when she spoke from beside me. Perhaps I just wanted her to still be alive so badly, her sudden appearance was simply my own way to deal with everything.
I can help you find your way back there, if you want,
she said, giving me her classic, playful smile. Hell yes, I'm only getting myself more lost by the minute.
Want to get going then?
Nah, I can't risk it in the daytime. Can't fix this if I'm behind bars, you know? We talked for a bit, just like we always did. No particular topic, just one pointless subject led to the other. We laughed and joked about all the craziness of the last few days, though it felt quite the grim discussion to be making light of. Still, it felt amazing to have her by my side again, and her being there made me far more confident that I may actually be able to pull this off. After a while, we took a stroll to find a place to grab something to eat. She was still as bouncy and enthusiastic as she had been when we first parked that old camper beside those very woods we were headed back to, and her joy was just as contagious as always. By the time we found a local diner, just off the road a mile or two from where we parked, I had almost forgotten how terrified I was about what lay ahead. I got some strange looks from the waitress and the guy behind the counter flipping burgers, as it would seem they could not see the person I was talking to. but the food tasted amazing nonetheless. After I noticed their erratic glances, I slid out of the seat to join my sister on the other side, with my back to the staff of the small roadside cafe. Lainey chuckled, joking about how crazy I must have looked to them, but I attempted to keep my words and laughs to a minimum. As unusual a situation as it was, I think Lane and I were both aware that she wasn't exactly there, but it didn't bother us. In some ways, I think I just saw the girl whose company I shared as the restless spirit of my beloved sister, more so than a manifestation of my messed up mind. I generally didn't believe in such things, but not too long ago, I didn't believe in creepy little skeleton creatures capable of altering people or reality either. Once my meal was done, I got up to pay. When I saw the cook was now on the phone, cutting his eyes back at me on occasion, I felt my chest heaving again, with the realization that the man may have recognized me, perhaps from the news or something. I just grabbed my change from the waitress and took off out the door. We may want to run, Lane, I said, already quickening my pace. She looked as nervous as I felt, so we gunned it back in the direction of the camper. I'd hoped to get a little rest before heading back towards the ghost town, but I just knew we had to get back on the road as soon as possible. I threw the door to the camper open, climbing inside and locking it behind me. Lainey was already in the passenger seat when I slid into my spot at the helm, and I cranked her right up.
We're close, Bri. We can be there within an hour if you follow my lead.
We're that close? I was sure.
Just go! Get back on the highway and take the first right you see.
I thought I heard sirens off in the distance, but I hope to God I was just imagining it. Once I backed out of the trail between the trees, I floored it to get back to the highway. It should only be a few miles from where I was, but I could still make out what could have possibly been the approaching horde of officers, as if they were not far behind us. I felt the tires bounce in and out of the cracks and splits in the neglected road, before the tarmac smoothed out once I pulled onto the highway. Just as Lainey yelled out, pointing towards the right turn we had to get on, the sirens grew significantly louder and were now accompanied by strobing lights from a ways behind us. Shit, I said, darting my eyes to my sister, who looked as worried as I.
Don't let up, baby brother!
She barked directions from one road to the next, and things were beginning to feel familiar to me again. We were close, maybe only a few more miles to go, but I could now make out the front bumpers of our pursuers. I pressed the pedal as far as it would go, but there wouldn't be the slightest chance of escaping a police car and a rusty old camper, no matter how well I maintained her. I knew the road wasn't far ahead now, as though I could feel it. All of the trees to our right were overgrown and unkempt, just like the ones that covered the buckled city limits sign, but I highly doubted I could even hope to lose the cops chasing us down. My sister looked over her shoulder, out the back window, before glancing back at me. I could feel the tightened skin of my knuckles as though the bones were about to tear through the flesh.
Just a little further.
Lainey said, with a certain intensity in her voice.
Keep going, Brian.
She was right beside me, having apparently gotten out of her seat to talk directly into my ear.
You know the turn now, right?
Yeah, Lane, I got this.
All right, kiddo. You hit that turn as soon as you get to it. And don't stop until you get to the other side. You got it?
Yeah, Lane?
I'll see you there, okay?
Lane? She just gave me a wink before running to the back of the camper and through the window, passing through the glass as though it weren't even there. Almost as soon as I saw the small gap in the trees ahead, with the slightest rim of the corner edge of the once green city limits sign, I pressed down the brake pedal while cutting the wheels to the right. While I faced sideways in the road for maybe a second or two at most, I saw my sister slam into the police car closest to me, causing the driver to lose control. It quickly veered to the other side of the road, flipping onto its roof and over as the one behind it screeched its tires to a halt before careening into the side of the other. I could still hear the slamming and crushing of metal against metal as I sped down the slender, single-lane road towards the city. I breathed a heavy sigh after assuring myself that I was alone on the bumpy and potholed pavement, with my pursuers having somehow been removed from the equation through the efforts of my deceased sister. It didn't make a damn bit of rational sense, but I didn't give it a second thought at the time. I hadn't had a chance to look upon the city with the sun shining down the last time we were here, but it strangely felt more ominous than it did after dark. Maybe it was simply the fact that I could make out the destruction of the little place in more vivid detail in the daylight. Perhaps it was nothing more than the reason I was here that led to the inherent foreboding in the recesses of my mind. Whatever the case, My hands were already beginning to tremble as I let off the gas a bit. I told myself I was just slowing my pace to more easily navigate the camper through the streets filled with rubble and debris, but I knew exactly what it was that caused me to no longer find myself in a rush. I could see the mountain ahead, looming over the berg like a feral beast preparing to pounce. No matter what I may be facing, this was not a choice I had much control over. It was this, or face the authorities and pay for the crimes I knew myself not to have committed, regardless of the facts that were handed to me. Maybe my sister did die when I was a kid, and my fragile and immature mind couldn't handle it, cracking under the weight of it, not unlike the tarnished pavement my wheels bounced across. Perhaps there was something else at play here, though, something I could potentially look upon very soon. It had been early when I got myself turned around and lost, so as I guided the old girl back onto the steeply inclined, slender, and rough road behind the ghost town, and saw the world falling into darkness around me, I couldn't help but find myself a bit more unsettled than I already was. I knew it wasn't long after leveling back out that we pulled over the last time I was here, but when I saw my own tire marks from our rapidly paced escape, I knew I had reached my destination. I sat in place, just glaring out into the trees for some time, unsure whether I was ready to venture out into the diseased and rotting trees. A good half hour or so of staring down the tree line, I lifted myself from the driver's seat, reached for my flashlight and the machete I had been able to pick up from the department store some miles back, and walked out of the RV. My initial footsteps were reluctant ones, but once I walked into the grass, still lined with the blackened leaves left in the wake of those who had chased us, I felt my pulse quickening again. It was then that I became aware of the noises, though they were somewhat more subdued than they were when they pulled me from my sleep what felt like both long ago and only yesterday at the same time. With my blade in one hand and my guiding light in the other, I took a deep breath and forced one leg in front of the other once more. As I wandered onwards towards the escalating sound, I noticed the blackened bark of the trees surrounding me, oozing that same dark pus. I walked into the wide clearing, recalling the woods falling lifeless as those creatures chased after us. Everything around the now deflated tents was as sickeningly diseased as the things I headed in search of, as the mist gently caressed the forest floor. I continued onward towards the sound, which only grew louder and louder. It wasn't until I stepped from within the woods back into that circular clearing that I found myself stunned, unable to move my feet from the ground. The rotten and skeletal creatures all stood, sat, or perched in the center of the clearing, maybe 15 of them altogether, though I didn't exactly waste time counting them. Each and every one of them had at least one hand gripped tightly onto my sister, who hovered above the ground as she had before. The flickering, flame-like orange lights of the things now shone brightly, somehow mimicking the light breaching from Lainey's mouth, nostrils, and eyes. They all looked as though they were in something of a trance as their glows carved through the darkness in varying directions, spilling across the fog and blackened bark surrounding them. I noticed my sister's skin appeared charred around where the seemingly endless bony fingers grasped, but she did not look in any sort of pain, as her gleeful expression would imply she was beyond content. My mind fought to regain its composure, to figure out what to do next. I still held my flashlight and machete, but my limbs ignored my pleas to do any more than hang limply at my sides. "Move, goddammit!" I commanded out loud, momentarily afraid I would prematurely gain the attention of the decayed little critters. I felt my left foot break free from the sticky ground, closely followed by my right. My arms still were not responding, but I would worry about that when I got closer to my goal. Those initial steps were slight, but each one gained more momentum than the last, finally garnering the aid of my arms. My mind was clearing more and more as my legs pursued each other. Right, left, one after the other, until I could pick up the stench of those grotesque little creatures. Before I could allow myself to give it a second thought, I softly carved the blade into the throat of one of those things that lay sprawled out on the ground, with one hand wrapped around my sister's ankle. It didn't do so much as twitch as its voice left its sibling's chorus of madness before the flickering flames of its eyes went dark. As its hand slipped away from Lainey's legs, leaving only the scarring left by its grasp, I noticed how thin and malnourished she appeared. It wasn't easy to get a clear look at her through the creatures gathered around where she hovered, but it looked as though the life force was being drained from her. I could only assume that these things were somehow feeding on her or being intoxicated by what they stole from her, but I would be damned if I was about to allow them to continue. But the realization that she had somehow been here, possibly this whole time, I was prepared to do whatever it took to get her back, to really get her back this time. I tried to keep my actions as controlled as possible as I guided the blade into the decaying flesh of the grotesque creatures with my shivering hands. I could only hope to not alert those still entranced as I left one after the other oozing their noxious, milky fluids onto the ground from their lifeless skeletal bodies. As I worked my way up to those hanging onto her arms, it was growing more difficult to keep my assaults somewhat silent. The higher up they were, the farther they had to fall, landing with a nasty slapping sound onto their fallen comrades. I still carried on, slicing throats and carving fatal wounds onto the brittle and hardened meat. Each of them spraying that creamy and foul-smelling pus across my clothes. As the chorus of their horrendous howls were growing softer from more voices falling silent, I sped my movements, pulling my blade from one and almost instantly slicing into another. I found I was now having to step over the mounds of corpses that lined the ground beneath me, causing me to take far more care with my jabs and cuts as to not inadvertently slice into Lainey. I finally had to take something of a step back to clear some of the heap from the path. I was somewhat distracted while heaving the gruesome sacks of rotten flesh away from my sister's feet, audibly gagging more than once. By the time I realized my shadow was being cast across the bodies I had already moved, I didn't have a chance to escape the blackened hands which latched onto my arms as soon as I turned around. All 10 of the remaining flickering eyes gazed into mine while my skin began to burn. I screamed as I attempted to move my arms, but I couldn't so much as break free from the tight grip. 2 of them held on to me with one hand each, but they were insanely strong for having such a seemingly weak and fragile frame. I kicked at their knees, causing them to shriek in a much more aggravated version of their maddening wails, but they still wouldn't release me. I continued to smack my heels against the bones on their legs while trying everything I could to pull away from them. The other 3 were bearing down on me now, each move stabbed into the ground while I made my efforts to clear a pathway, as another wrapped its fingers around my right arm, just below where the other hand still grasped tightly. I felt my thumb brush against the hilt of my blade. I gave another loud yell, both from the incredible pain of my scorched flesh, as well as the anguished desire to reach my weapon. I stretched my body as much as I could, grabbing onto the rubbery, textured hand, while another burning hand grasped the upper thigh of my right leg. Finally, I freed the blade from the dead grass and dirt before swatting it down upon each of the arms of the creatures who held me in place. Their shared squeals blended with my own as the skeletal forearms separated from the hands which still held me tight. I leapt back as the quintet bore down on me, now revealing haggard and gaping mouths, with more of that fiery aura glowing from within. Their stuttering movements quickened as they staggered at me, but I kept swinging my machete from one side to the other while I gathered my bearings. As I felt both of my feet secure themselves to the ground beneath me, I prepared to make my stand, no longer retreating. When the nearest one closed the gap between us, I sliced my blade across its midsection. The anguished howl erupted from its orifice again. It grasped at its stomach, attempting to hold in the meaty and tangled cords that spilled from behind the opening I made, before one last swat from my gore-lined weapon silenced it for good. I leapt towards the next 2, which staggered side by side towards me, until I carved deep into the chest of the one on the left before hacking a ditch into the neck of the other. When they fell to the ground, I struck them both again, just to be sure the deed was done. Only 2 remained, each of whom had begun to back away from me. But I would be damned if I was about to let them escape their shared fate. I dug the machete right through the upper torso of the next in line, before rearing back with all my might to separate the head from the spewing neck of the last. I stood there, heaving deep and exhausted breaths while continuing to slice through the meat and tissue of each and every one of my victims until I was damn sure that they would never grip their bony tendrils around anyone else ever again. I gripped at my side while buckling over, retching across the widely strewn mounds of gore I had scattered across the forest floor. I gasped for breath as my erratic lungs begged for me to take control and regulate my frenzied heartbeat. I gazed across the darkened area as the glowing from my sister was now the only thing illuminating the circular clearing. I looked around for my flashlight, but realized it was more than likely buried under the mass of rotten meat and bone, something I was not about to root through. I finally stepped toward my sister, not remotely hesitating before throwing my arms around her, pulling her close while begging her to awaken from her catatonic state. As I held her, I couldn't tell if my own feet were lifting from the ground or if she was descending to where I stood. But when the darkened forest dissolved before my eyes, I suddenly didn't care one way or the other. My entire body, no, my entire being was filled with such ecstasy as I had never even imagined possible. It felt as though I had escaped the body which imprisoned me, allowing me to soar above reality itself. Within what seemed to be no more than seconds, I watched my life play out before what I could only assume to be my mind's eye. I saw the child who would grow to be the man I could be, being brought into this world before taking my first steps, my first run, my first kiss, my first love. I just watched on as though I were living a movie, as I married the amazing woman I had known since junior high. I viewed the travels we would share together, along with the heartache of the struggles we would endure, but even the tears filled me with such awe. I could barely rationalize my thoughts. As one life ended, another began, as though I were switching the channels of a television tuned to a realm of possibilities. When I would come across a life I didn't care for, I found I could simply fast forward to the next. I saw myself go through so many trials and hardships, yet so many more wonders that showed me hope that pure and exhilarated joy can truly exist. It's so goddamn beautiful. I heard myself whisper, but it was far removed from where I was. As I gazed into the endless wonders of what could be, I was vaguely aware of the moans and whimpers as they left my mouth, but that was not where I lived anymore. My body was little more than a dream I no longer cared to take part in. It was an old, beaten-down car that I saw no reason not to leave deserted on the side of the road. Even when I became aware of fingers tightly wrapping themselves around my arms, I did not care. Let them have it, I thought. I didn't especially want it anymore. I felt the sensation of the vessel I once occupied being shaken, with something of a jarring that threatened to send me falling back into it. My grip on the wonders I viewed and somehow lived all at once began to slip, causing the experience to fragment slightly. I fought to maintain my connection, with my soul practically begging not to be pulled away. A voice called out from miles away, somewhere beyond the realm I struggled to remain in. There was a sudden and somewhat alarming pain that shot across what was once my face, causing my awareness to falter. The distant voice screamed from much closer than before. Something inside me became heavy, a weight I was once familiar with, something tangible that I began to crave ever so slightly. It was a hunger, almost, though I didn't know if that was the right word.
Ryan, snap out of it, damn it!
Another sharp and more shocking pain pulled me from the glorious oasis of the place beyond reality. I felt my body toppling back to the ground, momentarily confused as to what I was looking at. My eyes burned, feeling as though I hadn't used them in years. I was struggling to remember how to function within my body when I finally looked into the kind and loving eyes of my sister, which practically thrusted my mind back to the awareness of what led me here in the first place. The tears spilled down her sunken cheeks, while her lips quivered in a strained attempt to smile. I wrapped my arms around her and thought I could feel her ribs right below the surface, her heart rapidly beating against my own, causing a warmth to spread through me I never thought I would feel again. After a while like that, we helped each other back to the camper that still rested next to those ancient trees. I could already see signs of life returning to the forest behind us, assuring me that I had indeed put an end to those creatures who fed on my sister's bliss like a drug. As I guided the camper through the streets of the city from times long gone, I was quite reluctant at what we may be facing back in the real world. Yes, I had retrieved my sister, something I hadn't believed possible, but I still hadn't actually changed anything. Or so I thought at the time. I pulled out of the slender road and back onto the highway, next to the tarnished and warped city limits sign, seeing no sign of any wreckage that could have potentially been left by the police cars that chased after me. There weren't even any tire marks on the road from where I knew at least one of my pursuers had screeched onto the tarmac. I pulled up to a 24-hour diner just as the sun was beginning to rise. Lainey had been sleeping for the last hour or so, but I had to get some food into her incredibly malnourished body. Didn't wake up until I returned with some burgers and fries for us, and though she was quite groggy at first, she enthusiastically wolfed the meal down like it was the first thing she'd eaten in weeks. I didn't give her a choice about heading to the first emergency room I could find. Well, the first one far enough from the old ghost town anyway. Even if I was confident our nightmare may be reaching its end, I still wanted to be nowhere near that damn place by the time we stopped for the night. She actually didn't resist my recommendation, and given her weakened state, the nurse didn't waste any time getting her back to see a doctor. I also had to be treated for the hand-shaped burn marks on my arms, but while mine bore the oozing pinpricks, Lainey's did not this time. I could only assume that whatever infected her before was now coursing through my veins, but the hospital staff managed to get it under control before any blackened veins began to spiderweb from within. Lainey was kept in the hospital for a good week while she regained her strength, during which time I made some calls and checked online to see what I may still be facing. I reluctantly reached out to my mom, which was a conversation that did not at all go down like I was expecting. She assured me that she and her husband, my father, had lost their son when he was only a child, and the prank I was playing was nothing short of cruel. The more I insisted that I was who I claimed to be, the more enraged she grew, threatening to call the police. I hung up the phone, shocked by the revelation that I apparently did not belong here. I attempted to reach out to a few of my other contacts, but the numbers that still led to who I expected didn't know me either. Lainey and I talked a good deal about this, but she assured me that she still had my back no matter what. When she was ready to be released from the hospital, we resumed our cross-country trek back to the town I no longer had a place in. But at least I had my sister, the only person I could ever count on. Over the course of the journey back home, I began to feel an almost overpowering weakness, forcing me to yield the responsibility of driving the old camper to Lainey. Given the fact that she was far healthier than I had found her behind those ancient trees, she took no hesitation in accepting the task. Yes, she was still quite withered and was slowly recovering her strength, but her scars were almost completely faded, and she was already back to that energetic and youthful woman I had always loved. By the time our road trip came to its close, I could barely keep my eyes open for more than a few minutes at a time. Lainey insisted I let her take me to a hospital, but I had a feeling I knew what was happening. I didn't belong in this world, just as she had not belonged in the one that left me labeled a murderer. I have no regrets, all things considered. I think this is still a better outcome than being locked away for the rest of my life, or even being put to death for the crimes I did not commit. I just hope that Lainey will get through this. She's the best person I've ever known, and I'm just grateful I was able to get her back home, even if it's one I cannot join her in. It would seem this is the end of my story, but I thank you for hearing me out. I don't think I can record anymore now. It's getting harder to focus by the second, but that's it for me.
My name is Lainey Renee Harris, and it would seem, until recently, I had a brother. I don't remember him well, since he died when I was around 9 years old, but I know it hit Mom and Dad pretty hard. He was, like, 2, I think, when we lost him, but I can't say I really knew him, you know. He had a lot of medical issues, so he had to be kept in a sterile environment. I was always made to stay away from him, but only for his own good. I still felt bad when it got the better of him, though. I'm 30 now, and I'm part of a sort of think tank group of paranormal researchers. We were looking into this old ghost town that was apparently once called Rimrose Fall. But it took us a lot of work to even get that much information. My colleagues wanted to do some more looking into it before checking it out. But I think my curiosity got the better of me, and I headed across the country to see it for myself. But I think my curiosity got the better of me, and I headed across the country to see it for myself. When I got there, even though I was immediately intoxicated by the melancholy beauty of the broken-down old place, something, I guess, called to me from the mountain that stood behind it. I know that sounds like some crazy psychic cat lady shit, but that's the best way I can describe it. Before I knew it, I was weaving through the streets in my hand-me-down camper and speeding up the steep hillside road. Somewhere along the line, I sort of blacked out and didn't even come out of it until I just fell to the ground in the middle of an open space in the woods. I don't remember much, but there was a boy there, sort of floating above the ground. I know it sounds nuts, right? That's not even the weirdest part, though. At the time, I, knew him. Not just that, but I knew him as my brother. Totally forgetting that he died when I was a kid. I snapped him out of the trance he was in, and we booked it back to the camper. But it was our camper, not just mine. Crazy, right? So even though it had only been a little while from my perspective, I was all skin and bones, like I hadn't eaten for a month or something. And I had these burn marks all over my body and legs. Brian, my brother, got me to a hospital, and it took a week or so for me to get back on my feet. But by the time we headed back home, he was in bad shape. He asked me to finish what he was writing and post it online. But when I read it, I couldn't even believe what I was seeing, you know? I guess I was already myself again by the time he just vanished. That's right. I took the luggage back into my house, came back out, and he was just gone. Anyway, even though I didn't see him as my brother after I got my mind right, I know he helped me. So finishing his story and posting it is the least I can do. It does make me a bit sad if everything he had written was true, because it doesn't sound like we would have been pretty close if my brother had survived. It's weird because even though I know who I am and what my life has been, I miss him, you know? I feel like we'd only just met, but I'd known him for years at the same time. I do wonder where he is now, though. Maybe I'll never know, but I hope it's somewhere happy. I think he deserves that. I think he deserves that. For some reason, I'm crying right now. I feel as if my heart is breaking. It's like I've lost a part of me I never knew I had. If that makes sense at all. I'm not sure if I'll ever really come to grips with everything that happened, but I hope I will. Maybe my kid brother is still out there somewhere, in some magical place beyond the walls of reality. Of course, it's very possible that I'm still there, too.
My mother died suddenly and unexpectedly sometime in the early hours of Sunday morning. The coroner said she'd suffered a massive stroke and her death would have been instantaneous. This brought me some small comfort, knowing that she hadn't suffered in the end. I was the one who found her, I had arrived at her tidy, semi-detached suburban house Sunday at lunchtime, bringing with me her food shopping for the coming week. Feared the worst when she didn't answer the door after repeated knocks and rings. It was with great trepidation that I used my spare key and marched through the hallway, shouting my mother's name in a panic as I frantically searched, hoping for the best but expecting the worst outcome. I found her lying down on the sofa, her eyes shut. Mom looked so peaceful, like she'd simply fallen asleep. For a fleeting second, I believed this might be the case, but when I touched her, her skin was cold. It didn't take me long to realize she had no pulse and wasn't breathing. Finding my mother's lifeless body was obviously a very traumatic experience. However, at the time, I felt oddly calm as I went through the ritual of calling an ambulance, waiting for the paramedics to arrive to tell me what I already knew. My father had died 1 year before, having lost a long battle against cancer. My parents had been married for 36 years, and Mom dedicated herself to caring for her husband after his diagnosis. When he died, the largest part of her died with him. She was overcome with grief, barely able to function, and having little interest in life. I asked her to move in with us, thinking it would do her good to be around family, but she steadfastly refused to leave the home she'd shared with her husband for 3 decades. Instead, we compromised. I went to see her each and every day, doing her shopping and making sure she was eating, washing, and looking after herself. I always hoped she would bounce back, but deep down I realized it was only a matter of time. Mom's death certificate said she succumbed to a stroke, but I knew she died of a broken heart. It's tough losing your parents, even when, like me, you're an adult with a family of your own. I'm married and have 2 children, so I'm very blessed, but I still miss my mom and dad every day. Lots of people will be able to relate to my loss, but this isn't why I'm recording this story. What I'm here to talk about is the 40-year-old diary I found in my mother's attic. I never met my uncle. My mother's brother died a few years before I was born. Mom spoke fondly of her older brother and how he'd looked out for her when they were little. She didn't like talking about his death, only saying he was a policeman killed in the line of duty. We took this to mean he served in the Royal Ulster Constabulary and was probably killed during the Troubles, the ethno-religious conflict that plagued our home country of Northern Ireland for nearly 30 years. Mom got upset every time the topic was brought up, and so she rarely talked about my uncle's police career when I was growing up. My sister and I had taken on the emotionally draining task of clearing out my parents' house after Mom died. We found this quite difficult, as just about every photograph, ornament, and knick-knack had some sort of sentimental value or memory attached to it. We shed more than a few tears during those days of work, and I found it upsetting to be in the house where I'd discovered Mom's dead body, but we supported each other and persevered. I found the dust-covered old box in the back of the attic, buried under years' worth of memorabilia and assorted junk. It contained what little remained of my late uncle's possessions, mostly related to his service with the RUC. Inside, I found his neatly folded uniform and peaked cap, both in miraculously good condition given their age. Thankfully, the moths hadn't gotten at the material. Other than this, there was a few old black and white photographs of my uncle on his graduation day from the police training college. There he was, looking smart and handsome in his dress uniform, standing to attention while smiling for the camera. He looked very impressive. I guessed my uncle was slightly younger than me when these photos were taken, but I could definitely see the family resemblance. I dug deeper into the box of forgotten memories, finding a number of dog-eared and faded papers relating to his service and postings. And there was something else, a small leather-bound notebook. I flicked through the first few pages and was taken aback to discover it was my uncle's diary, recording his service as a cop on the front lines of West Belfast during the 1970s, some of the worst years of the Troubles. I informed my sister of my discovery, but she wasn't overly interested, and so I inherited my late uncle's possessions, including his diary. I took the notebook home, intending to study the journal entries in detail. I believed the diary would be of historical interest and provide an insight into an uncle I'd never met. I hoped it would serve as a link to the past, a connection to my family that would otherwise be lost after my mother's death. However, I became increasingly disturbed the more I read. My uncle clearly had a very difficult job. As a CID detective, he was tasked with investigating some of the most brutal, sectarian murders of the period, while at the same time being a target for the paramilitaries. His entries demonstrated he was working under tremendous mental strain. I trained as a counselor and would conclude from his writings that my uncle suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. His detailed and visceral descriptions of murder scenes and atrocities make for a difficult reading, but there are elements of his story that I cannot explain, incidents and occurrences beyond rational understanding. For this reason, I have decided to transcribe and post my uncle's diary entries, in hope that someone with more insight than me may be able to shed some light on the bizarre and disturbing events described by my late uncle. And so, here it is. November 1976. I've never kept a diary before, never had any inclinations to. The truth is, I'm not much of a writer. Essays and police reports usually, that's my lot. That's not to say I'm uneducated. I was the first in my family to go to university, an achievement my parents were proud of. I grew up in a Protestant working-class community in East Belfast. Our family wasn't wealthy, but we weren't hard up either. My father worked all his life as a welder in the shipyards, as his fathers had done before him. It was expected that I would follow in their footsteps, but I surprised everyone by excelling in my education, gaining a place in a prestigious grammar school before going to Queen's University to study for my law degree. By the time I graduated, my homeland was in turmoil. Civil rights protests had turned violent, with rioting on the streets. The army was deployed to keep the peace, but the violence escalated, with hundreds of deaths during the early years of the decade. Bombings and shootings were an everyday occurrence, and my home city was being torn apart in front of my very eyes. This made my decision of career path easier. I hated what the terrorists were doing to my country and wanted to play my part in ending the violence. And so, the RUC was the obvious choice. To be fair, my motives weren't entirely altruistic. Northern Ireland's police force was being rapidly expanded due to the security situation, and so, thanks to my university degree, I was able to apply for a fast track into the CID, with the prospect of further promotions to follow. I finished my training during the summer of 1973, graduating from the police college with my parents and little sister in attendance. A proud day, but soon, I was thrown in at the deep end, with my first posting in Gulf Barracks. I've seen some terrible things over the last 3 years. The aftermath of bombings, human bodies torn to shreds by bullets and shrapnel, and colleagues gunned down whilst carrying out their duties. These atrocities had an impact upon me. And in a case of out of the frying pan and into the fire, I got redeployed to the CID section in West Belfast. In recent months, my life has spiraled out of control, as the stresses of the job have taken their toll. My girlfriend left me a couple of weeks ago as she could no longer deal with my erratic behavior and violent outbursts. I can't really blame her. I hardly speak with my family and friends anymore. My job has become all-encompassing, and I have little time for anything else. When I'm not working, I drink heavily, trying to drown my sorrows and forget the horrific things I've seen out on the streets. It doesn't really help, but I can't stop. As 1976 draws to a close, I'm working on 2 major investigations. One against a skilled and ruthless provisional IRA bomb maker, codenamed Nemesis. This dangerous individual has been responsible for dozens of attacks against the security forces and commercial businesses in the city center. We've come close to capturing Nemesis, but the bastard keeps slipping through our fingers. I have no doubt that he'll keep bombing until we either capture or kill him. The second investigation relates to a loyalist murder gang led by a terrorist known as the Butcher. This gang specializes in kidnapping Catholic men and brutally torturing their victims before slitting their throats. The sheer brutality of this gang has shocked and terrified the population, even though this city has long become hardened to violence and death. Blood is running through the streets of Belfast, and we're barely able to hold the lines. I was raised in the Protestant faith and was made to go to Sunday school when I was younger. Nevertheless, I've never been particularly religious. I'm not a superstitious man, but some of what I've witnessed over the last few months defies any logical explanation. I honestly don't know whether I'm going mad, but I've become increasingly convinced that the bloodshed has unleashed something truly evil onto the war-torn streets of Belfast, a shadowy entity that stalks me and haunts my dreams. For this reason, I have decided to keep this journal and record what I see and hear, in the hopes that one day someone will be able to make sense of it all. For with God as my witness, for the first time in my life, I am truly scared. November 21st, 1976. The butcher has struck again. A housewife discovered the body dumped in a back alley off Agnes Street. At first, she assumed the corpse was a discarded mannequin doll, as the wounds were so severe. The victim's injuries were consistent with the previous murders. The man is still to be identified, but we've determined he is in his early 20s. There were multiple stab wounds and deep cuts across his hands, arms, and torso, none of which would have proved fatal. The cause of death was the man's throat being slit, cut so deep that the bone was exposed. The torture and killing evidently occurred at a different location, the body being dumped here by the murder gang. We'll trace the victim's identity over the next day or two after we trawl through the missing persons list. The family will be notified, and the press will need to be updated. Doubtless, there will be more sensationalist headlines in the tabloid papers. This is the third murder by the Butcher Gang in the last 6 months. All victims have been young Catholic males, kidnapped at random from the streets. Undoubtedly, there will be a statement released by some anonymous paramilitary spokesman, a generic claim that the victim confessed under interrogation to membership of the IRA and had been executed for crimes against the people of Ulster. Our investigation is focused upon 3 loyalist terror cells operating in the Shankill area. I have strong suspicions as to the butcher's identity, but so far we have no evidence. The gang has been good at covering their tracks, and witnesses are in short supply. We spent most of the day at the crime scene, freezing on a gray, drizzly afternoon. The army set up a security cordon, as was our standard procedure. A number of locals gathered around the cordon, the usual combination of nosy neighbors and ghoulish voyeurs hoping for a glance at the body. A few journalists showed up during the course of the afternoon, snapping photos and taking notes. They asked for a statement, but we weren't willing to give them any information at this early stage. Night had fallen by the time we moved the corpse, shifting his remains into a body bag and putting the poor fellow into the back of a waiting ambulance. By now, most of the crowd had moved on. They'd seen it all before, after all. I scanned the cordon as my colleagues moved the body, spotting one solitary figure lingering at the far side of the street, lurking in the shadows and glaring in my direction. The stranger was clad all in black, with a hood covering his head. I couldn't see his face or make out any of his features. I'm not a man who scares easily, but the sight of this mysterious figure brought a chill down my spine. He looked like a man out of his time, a throwback to a previous age. Nevertheless, despite his odd appearance, there was something strangely familiar about this interloper, and I felt sure I'd seen him before, although where and when I cannot recall. I stared at this individual for the best part of 2 minutes, trying to get the measure of him. He didn't move an inch during the whole time, standing perfectly still and seemingly not reacting to anything occurring around him. Even though I could not see his eyes, I could nevertheless feel his harsh glare burning through me. My first instinct was to turn and flee, but as a policeman, I needed to show strength. This individual hadn't technically committed an offense, but security legislation gave me the right to detain and question him. I decided to do so, but before I could make my move, I got temporarily distracted by one of my colleagues asking me a question. When I turned back, the dark figure had gone, apparently disappearing without a trace. I asked the Army lieutenant in command of the security cordon about the mysterious man, but the officer could not recall seeing him, nor could any of his men. The whole incident left me feeling shaken and confused. Had I imagined this figure? I don't believe so. I have an unnerving feeling that I've seen this stranger somewhere before, perhaps more than once, but always lurking in the shadows, somewhere on the periphery. I fear I'm being stalked. Perhaps the IRA or some other paramilitary group is targeting me, gathering intelligence for a possible hit. I've therefore decided to become more vigilant regarding my personal security. Hopefully I'm overreacting, but you can't be too careful these days. December 5th, 1976. I've been receiving threatening phone calls to my home line. 3 nights in a row now, all during the early hours. The first night it was a little more than heavy breathing and low groans, making me think it was just some sort of pervert. I told the caller to go to hell and hung up the phone. The next night I could hear low whispers down the line, so soft I couldn't make out a single word. By the third night I could make out words, but they were spoken in a language I could not understand. The male voice at the other end of the line had a detached, almost inhuman quality to it. I've been unable to make out any accent or speech patterns which could help identify the caller. I've developed this unsettling feeling that I'm being watched, and these late-night calls seem to confirm a pattern of intimidation. Tomorrow I will make a report to the duty officer, and I plan to sleep with my service rifle close to hand from now on. January 4th, 1977. I was called to the scene of a bombing this morning. An army patrol was hit on the lower falls by a small but deadly device hidden inside of a beer keg, detonated by a hidden command wire. 4 soldiers were injured in the blast, but the man closest to the bomb took the brunt of it, losing both legs and also suffering severe chest wounds. He was still alive when we arrived at the scene, his body reduced to a bloody mess, his eyes mad with shock and pain as he screamed out and grasped for the bloody stumps that were once his legs. They rushed him to the hospital in a Saracen APC, but he died from massive blood loss before they got there. I later learned the dead soldier was only 19 years old. We evacuated the wounded and secured the scene. What remained of the device was removed for further forensic investigation, although the design and MO pointed to the bomb maker we were pursuing, an IRA operative codenamed Nemesis. His devices are becoming increasingly lethal as he plies his deadly trade. We didn't get long to examine the scene. A crowd soon gathered on the edge of the security cordon, including a number of young men who jeered and mocked the wounded men. The soldiers manning the blockade were from the same company as the dead private, and understandably, they were upset and angry. A few soldiers reacted to the provocation, moving into the crowd while swinging their batons and attempting in vain to make arrests. Soon, more local youths arrived on the scene, carrying half-bricks and glass bottles, which they flung at the line of soldiers. Within minutes, the situation had descended into a full-scale riot. As the violence escalated, the army officer in command on the grounds told us he can no longer guarantee our safety. As intelligence suggested, the IRA may use the riot as a cover to launch a gun attack upon our personnel. Therefore, we had little choice but to evacuate the scene, knowing all too well that potential forensic evidence would be destroyed in the rioting. I was being shoved into the back of an APC when I saw him out of the corner of my eye. The dark figure, the same mysterious man I'd seen that night in November on Agnes Street. It was broad daylight this time, so I got a better look at him. Not that I could see much, as his head was covered by a dark hood and his face by some sort of mask. He blatantly stood in the middle of the street as all hell broke out around him, with rioters throwing missiles and soldiers firing rubber bullets. The chaos seemed to have no effect on the interloper, as he showed no fear of being shot or struck. I honestly couldn't tell whether he was directing the riot or oblivious to it. However, once again he appeared to be looking straight at me, as if he'd come to this violent place specifically to confront me. But I only cast my eyes on the hooded man for a brief moment before an army NCO physically dragged me into the back of the vehicle, slamming the steel door shut behind me. This time, I'm certain the dark figure wasn't a figment of my imagination. He is real, and is deliberately turning up at the crime scenes where he knows I'll be posted, stalking me through these war-torn streets. I need to get this bastard before he gets me. January 11th, 1977. The late-night phone calls have become less frequent, but more sinister in their tone. Last night he spoke in understandable English for the first time, speaking just 3 terrifying words in a low, creaking voice.
I see you.
I'm now convinced there is a direct link between the shadowy figure and the threatening calls. I must remain vigilant. I didn't sleep at all last night, but instead drank until dawn with my Webley service revolver by my side. These images keep running through my head. The butchered victim, the screaming soldier without his legs, and always the dark figure, watching and taunting me. Honestly, I don't know how much more of this I can take. January 12th, 1977. My boss saw the state of me when I turned up for roll call and sent me straight home. I've been ordered to rest up for a week before returning to duty. I told my commander about the calls and the stalker. He says he'll look into it, but I got the distinct impression that he thinks I'm mad. Perhaps he's right. I've been under extreme stress and haven't been sleeping. Hopefully, the rest will do me good. January 15th, 1977. I'm still off duty, but got a call from one of my colleagues. The chief suspect in the Butcher gang has been arrested on a weapons charge. With a successful conviction, he'll get at least 5 years. It's not what we'd hoped for. The bastard should be charged with murder, but at least he'll be off the streets. The news has boosted my spirits somewhat, but the violence continues across the city. Yesterday, there was a series of bombings across the town center, and no doubt Nemesis played his role. The streets are awash with blood, and terror stalks the streets. What can one man do against such unrelenting hatred? January 20th, 1977. Last night was my first shift back on duty following my leave of absence. My boss has taken me off the murder investigations. I objected, but not too hard. I got put on night duty with a squad of uniformed officers. This was meant to be an easy job to get me back into the swing of things, but it didn't turn out that way. It was a freezing cold night, and me and the boys were warming ourselves up with hot mugs of tea when the call came in. A disturbance was reported on a back street off the Antrim Road in the north of the city. Local residents had reported strange activity and raised voices emanating from inside of an abandoned Victorian mill at the end of their street. We went out in strength, 8 heavily armed officers traveling in 2 armored Land Rovers as we sped through the dark city streets. The area was mixed religion, but known for IRA activity, and so we were understandably cautious, as we feared a potential setup and ambush. Our suspicions were heightened when we reached the scene and discovered the street abandoned and eerily quiet. Proceeding with caution, the sergeant in command ordered 2 officers to set up a cordon at the end of the street, while the rest of us proceeded with guns drawn. The road was typical of those throughout the working-class districts of Belfast, with rows of red-bricked terraced houses, old 2-ups and 2-downs dating back to the Victorian era. The mill sat at the far end of the street, its dark structure casting an ominous shadow over the small houses beneath it. At one time, the mill would have provided employment to the men and women in this area, but it had long since closed like so many others, resulting in high unemployment in communities such as this. The abandoned industrial building held a sinister appearance, reminding me of a grim citadel from some kind of dark fairy tale. We had no idea what to expect. I hoped we were dealing with minor vandalism caused by bored teenagers, but something didn't seem right about the whole situation. There was a terrible tension in the air. We all felt it. Once again, I had the feeling that I was being watched. I carefully scanned up and down the road, but it was too dark to see anything. My fear was back, worse than ever. I worried that I'd come back to duty too early. My head was still a mess, and my paranoia was taking over, but there was nothing I could do in that moment except march forward. Suddenly, the street was no longer silent. We heard a faint noise emanating from the supposedly abandoned mill, growing gradually louder the closer we came. It took me a moment to comprehend what I was hearing. There were multiple voices chanting in unison, singing deeply in a language that clearly wasn't English. I thought I recognized a few words in Latin, but I couldn't be sure. This was a bizarre occurrence, and the last thing any of us had expected to encounter on this night. There was something very sinister about the strange chanting. It felt out of place in time, but yet oddly familiar. I could tell the other officers were as uneasy as I was. No doubt we all wanted to turn around and run for the hills, but we were professionals and had a job to do. The unsettling chanting continued, growing louder and faster until it reached a crescendo before it suddenly stopped. And then we heard the scream, blood-curdling as it cut through the cold night air, chilling me to my very bone.
Move, move, move!
Our sergeant cried out as he surely realized someone was in trouble. We began to sprint along the cobblestones, making for the sealed front entrance of the mill, clutching our weapons close, ready for action. The Sarge reached the door first, smashing it open with his heavy boot. He barged inside and we all followed. I feared what we would discover inside, but what we found was beyond my wildest imagination. The interior of the derelict building was largely shrouded in darkness, with the only light coming from lit candles and torches on the floor and hanging from the walls. In the center of the empty space was a circle drawn in the middle of the floor and surrounded by candles. The Sarge used a handheld battery-powered torch to illuminate the scene. To my horror, I realized the circle was in fact a pentagram, and at its very center lay a slaughtered animal, a goat by the look of it. The creature's throat had been cut and its stomach sliced open, exposing its intestines and internal organs. The place stank like an abattoir, and the ground was covered in blood. It took me a second to comprehend what I was seeing here. The satanic symbol and slaughtered animal. It was some sort of sacrifice. How could this be possible? The sergeant nervously raised his torch and shone the light upwards to reveal a half-dozen figures dressed in black robes and hooded masks. Each one stood perfectly still, glaring with menace in our direction. All were armed with daggers, stained with the blood of the slaughtered goat. The Sarge screamed at them to drop their weapons and surrender. We covered them with our guns as we waited to see whether they would comply. I clutched hold of my Webley with both hands, aiming at the chest of the closest dagger-wielding maniac. I was perfectly prepared to shoot the bastard down if he showed even the slightest sign of resistance, but this proved unnecessary, as suddenly all six dropped their daggers and calmly got down on their knees, allowing us to move in and handcuff them. I breathed a sigh of relief, but this feeling proved to be short-lived. When we unmasked the suspects, we discovered they were 4 males and 2 females of varied ages. They refused to give their names and carried no forms of ID or any personal items for that matter. We arrested them on suspicion of trespassing, animal cruelty, and possession of offensive weapons. The Sarge seemed unsettled by the whole affair, saying he'd never seen anything like it in all of his 20 years of service. But what really shook me to my core was when one of the suspects turned his head around and looked me directly in the eye, specifically picking me out of the crowd. He was an unpleasant-looking man, perhaps in his late 30s or early 40s. He had one of those weasel-like faces, pale skin, bloodshot eyes. His chin was covered in a thick, untidy stubble, and he stank to high heavens, which suggested that he hadn't bathed or showered in days. I experienced a cold chill inside me whenever he made eye contact, but I stood my ground, knowing I couldn't show this lowlife any fear. He opened his mouth to reveal chipped yellow teeth, and he spoke in broken English. I didn't recognize the accent, but what he said was this.
My master, he sees you. He will come for you. Soon, you will have nowhere left to hide.
I stood glued to the spot, my jaw hanging in disbelief. His words terrified me, and I had no response. One of my comrades reacted, punching the suspect in the stomach and telling him to shut his gob. 2 officers dragged the man away while I remained frozen, unable to speak or move until the Sarge patted my back, telling me to head back to the waiting Land Rovers. I didn't sleep a wink last night after I got home. Instead, I turned to the bottle once again, drinking until dawn. I realized this isn't a solution, but I needed something to settle me after what I'd been through. In the morning, I received a phone call from the duty sergeant. He told me that all 6 suspects arrested at the mill had been released without charge. Apparently, the orders had come from the top, but no explanation was given. The sergeant mentioned reports of other ritualistic animal sacrifices and black masses occurring across Ulster, and of rumored links to British military intelligence. The theory was some kind of psychological operation aimed against the paramilitaries and their supporters. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Is there no end to this madness? Has this entire city descended into the depths of hell? How much more can one man be expected to take? February 4th, 1977. I almost died today. They literally came within inches of taking me out. It had been a quiet couple of weeks, or at least as quiet as a cop working in Belfast could have. I was still on the beat with the uniformed patrols. There had been incidents, of course, but none as bizarre and unsettling as the encounter in the old mill. I hadn't received any threatening phone calls in the last fortnight, had cut down on my drinking, and was even sleeping better. I truly believed I had turned a corner, but you can never take your eyes off the ball in this job. Our unit got called out to a crime scene in Ballymurphy. The switchboard received a call reporting a break-in, and so we were sent out to investigate. As usual, we went out in strength, attending in armored Land Rovers and fully armed. Details were sketchy, and so we were naturally suspicious. Rightly so, as it transpired, because this caution saved our lives. The device was hidden inside a dustbin left down a side alley. I was only about 12 feet away from the bomb when it detonated. I remember a blinding light and a deafening din, followed a split second later by a powerful wave of heat which blew me off my feet, throwing me backwards. I hit the ground hard, feeling a sharp pain shoot through my entire body. After that, I lay dazed on the pavement, my head throbbing, vision blurred, and ears still ringing from the blast. The dark figure appeared from nowhere and stood right above me. My eyesight was still affected, and so I could not make out his facial features. In fact, he was little more than a dark shadow standing over my stricken body, blocking out the sun. Nevertheless, I knew it was him, the same shadowy figure who'd been stalking me for weeks. And now he had me, wounded and helpless, left completely at his mercy. My vision was starting to come back, but I couldn't bear to look at his hideous figure, and so I closed my eyes and prepared for the end. Seconds passed, and slowly my hearing returned. I heard men shouting and a heavy clump of boots against the pavement. Reluctantly, I opened my eyes, and to my great relief, the dark man was gone, his shadowy figure replaced by the concerned looks of my comrades as they came to my aid. Miraculously, I walked away from the blast with only minor injuries, cuts and bruises, and a slight concussion. A piece of flying shrapnel had grazed my head. A couple of inches to the right, and it would have been embedded in my skull. It didn't take long for the investigating officers to establish that the device was the work of Nemesis, the IRA bomber responsible for so many previous attacks in this part of the city. The bomb design and style of attack were both very similar to that which killed the young soldier back in January. It seems that, on this occasion, the IRA member tasked with detonating the device had missed his mark. The bomb had gone off a tad too early. If he'd waited just a couple more seconds to detonate, then I would be dead, and several of my colleagues severely maimed. As it turned out, we all walked away from the blast in one piece. I should be feeling like the luckiest man alive right now, but I don't. The dark figure is back. I don't know whether he's a man or some kind of ghoulish entity, but I do know he's out to get me. My colleagues think I'm either mad or delusional, and my boss has put me on an extended leave of absence. But it doesn't matter. He, or it, failed on this occasion, but he won't stop until I'm in the ground. My days are numbered. It's only a matter of time now. February 7th, 1977. The calls have started again, worse than ever this time. The things I've listened to were surely never meant for human ears. I'm just connecting my phone. There's no reason for anybody to be calling me. I'm still on leave of absence from work, but I find no respite. I spend my nights drinking with my gun by my side. I can't sleep for any length of time. Every time I close my eyes, my mind is filled with these horrifying images. He's always there, haunting my dreams. I know he's watching me. I'll never be free. February 7th, 1977. My sister came to my house this afternoon. I guess she's worried about me. Probably she's been trying to call me, but can't get through with the phone unplugged. She was at the door for more than 15 minutes, repeatedly banging the knocker and ringing the bell. I didn't answer. All my curtains were drawn and the lights turned off. She must have thought I was out, so she eventually gave up. I can't bear for her to see me like this. Her big brother, reduced to a cowardly drunken mess. It's for the best anyway. Whatever is happening to me, whoever and whatever is after me, I can't let my little sister get involved. I need to protect her. February 13th, 1977. The IRA bomber known as Nemesis is dead. The security forces played no role in his demise. Ironically, he died by his own hand after a bomb he was working on detonated prematurely, blowing him to bits and demolishing the safe house he was sequestered inside. It's an occupational hazard for those in his line of work. My bosses would rather have arrested and convicted the bastard, but they weren't necessarily displeased with the outcome. Neither was I, not at first anyway. My commander invited me to attend the scene. I was still technically on suspension, but my boss was willing to bend the rules to allow me to be there when they carried the bomber's dismembered body parts out from the rubble. The bastard had tried to kill me after all, so the hope was his violent death would grant me some closure. We arrived on the street to discover a chaotic scene, with the road cordoned off at both ends, while soldiers and police officers dug through the rubble of the demolished house. While the security forces worked, the predictable crowds gathered around the cordons. Some young men swore and shouted abuse at the soldiers, but mostly people were just curious. One woman stood out, though. A young woman with long red hair tied back in a bun. She was clearly upset and very agitated, screaming at the troops about a missing child. It took us some time to establish what had happened. The woman's child was an 8-year-old girl called Aoife. She'd been playing on the street in front of the safe house at the exact moment the bomb exploded. We found her dead body buried beneath the rubble about an hour later. Her mother wailed in all-encompassing grief when we carried her little girl out, grabbing hold of the tiny body and grasping it tightly to her bosom. I've seen a lot of terrible things during my time, but nothing as tragic as this. And he was there, of course. The dark man, lingering in the shadows just outside of the cordon, watching on and mocking me. It seems he is drawn to death, destruction, and human agony. I think he thrives on it. I attempted to ignore him, but I could still feel his hateful glare burning into the back of my head. I returned home afterwards and instantly hit the bottle. I couldn't stop thinking about that poor little girl. What had she ever done to deserve this? I thought of my younger sister and how I'd feel if something so awful happened to her. Later that night, I turned on the radio to listen to the news reports of today's incident. The IRA had released a statement describing the dead bomber as a brave Irish patriot who gave his life in the cause of freedom, while young Afy's death was a tragic accident and a painful reminder of the British occupation of our country. I saw